Redeemed Zoomer is right about Mormonism, and I am one.
You define Jesus as a tomato.
Well, not with the tomato worship, but with the part that we worship a different Jesus. However, this argument that you need to have the right idea of Jesus in your head or else you're going to hell says something interesting about mainstream Christianity and why I reject it. And since I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I get this wrong Jesus stuff a lot, and by way of explaining why it's kind of a dumb argument, I'll just casually jump into the arena with maybe the most powerful Christian voice in the world, which definitely can't go wrong.
Who are you, buddy?
I'm glad you asked. I'm Saint Explainer. I explain LDS stuff, and because this Mormons worship the wrong Jesus thing is so common, I figure I ought to address it on this channel at some point. And I ought to address it better than this thing that NPC apologists do, where they just insist that our Jesus is actually the same as everyone else's Jesus and that we're really just like you. This is obviously not true, and it's one of several things that they do to torpedo their own credibility. Anyway, let me put some context on Redeemed Zoomer's arguments from his recent video on ecclesial anxiety. But before I get into that, I just want to say that I am not at all trying to strawman him. I'm going to do my best to be fair to what he has to say. I like Redeemed Zoomer despite all the kind things he has to say about my religion, and I gave him a Chad face in the pixel art, which if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know is a rare honor. So anyway, Redeemed Zoomer is arguing against the idea of ecclesial anxiety, or being worried about going to hell because you picked the wrong Christian denomination to join. Several Christian denominations either do now or have in the past claimed that the only people who are going to be saved are members of their church, which understandably leads to some nervousness since these claims are mutually contradicting. Do you think you'll sue me for using his church logos? Mr. Zoomer is saying that you won't go to hell for being in the wrong denomination, that faith in Jesus Christ is what matters rather than visible unity to a specific organization. But he puts a big caveat on this when it comes to certain groups, including Mormons.
These people do not have a promise of salvation. But the reason is not because they lack something additional to faith in Christ, it's because they don't have faith in Christ. If you say you believe in Jesus, but you define Jesus as a tomato, you don't believe in Jesus. What matters is not the sign, the verbal sign, but the thing signified.
So he's saying that you must believe in Jesus to be saved, but faith in Jesus requires having the correct idea about Jesus in your head. He goes on to say some things about how Mormon beliefs differ from those of mainstream Christianity and why that means we don't really worship the same God, and I fully agree with that, but I want to move on to his discussion of Unitarianism, another group that he does not consider Christian, because it's more relevant to where I'm going with the rest of this video.
Unitarians don't believe in Jesus because they do not believe in the Trinity, and Jesus is inseparable from the rest of the Trinity. Since Jesus' person has two natures, a human nature and a divine nature, you have to believe in both of Jesus' natures to really believe in Jesus. You have to believe that Jesus is human, and you have to believe that Jesus is God. That doesn't mean you have to fully understand how that works, that's fine. But rejecting that means you do not really believe in Jesus. Jesus is one person, he has two natures, so you have to believe in Jesus' humanity and his divinity to be saved.
So here he lays out a logical definition of Jesus' human nature and his divine nature, and that you have to believe both that Jesus is human and that Jesus is God in order to have the correct belief in Jesus. Which, to oversimplify, is the definition set forth in the First Council of Nicaea way back when, which defined, or at least started to define, Trinitarian doctrine as we understand it today. It declared its position to be correct and other ideas about the nature of Jesus to be heretical. But this was far from the last such dispute. A little bit later, there was another council where they decided that it was correct in Trinitarianism to call Mary the Mother of God, but the Church of the East wasn't so sure about this, so they got condemned as heretics and kicked out. A little bit after that, there was another council where they said that Christ has two natures, a human nature and a divine nature. But the Oriental Orthodox said that Christ only has one nature, which is human and divine. I get that that's a gross oversimplification, but I don't have time to explain metaphysitism right now. Anyway, what happened is that the Oriental Orthodox got kicked out and condemned. Even the split between Catholicism and Orthodoxy was, among other things, a dispute over how the Trinity worked internally. And even beyond all this, Nicaea wasn't the first dispute about Jesus' nature either. There were all kinds of ideas about him thrown around in the early history of Christianity. So while Redeemed Zoomer and other Christian apologists present the Jesus is God Trinitarianism of the Council of Nicaea as the standard for who's in and who's out, it historically has not been this. Each of the other subsequent disputes involved groups declaring each other to be mutually damned, a stance which has only recently been softened. Zoomer will brag to you that this softening is the result of Protestant ecumenism, the idea that all Christians are Christian. So while the Council of Nicaea is not the historic standard for going to hellness or not, it is the definition of Christ's nature, the idea about him which all the surviving ancient groups can accept. And this is what actually matters, because the point is ecumenism, which is to say that what is taught about who goes to heaven and who goes to hell is an entirely historically contingent thing. But anyway, I'm not here to argue whether the idea about Jesus presented in the Council of Nicaea is a good place to define Christianity or not. I want to focus on the idea that you need the right idea of Jesus in your head in order to have real faith in the first place. And this idea is nearly universally accepted, and it makes sense because so much of their history has been arguing about why certain ideas about Jesus and his nature are wrong to the point of deserving damnation. And I just have to stop and ask, why through all of these centuries of conflict did Christians not just stop to compare the ideas they had about Jesus with the actual Jesus and figure out which ideas are correct? The fact that they never did this suggests that they can't, that there's some disconnection with the actual Jesus, such that getting the right idea about him in your head is actually kind of difficult, because they don't have a point of reference to compare to. If that's the case, then the best that you can do is start thinking about how Jesus should be, and then just declare that that's how Jesus is. So I think that Christianity knows a lot about the divine, or at least claims to, but doesn't actually know the divine. There's this fundamental disconnection between them and Jesus, which has led to millennia of arguing about ideas about him because they don't have any better way to know him, which is more or less Joseph Smith's criticism of the Christianity of his time. And it's also more or less the criticism that he claimed Jesus had of mainstream Christianity. Which leads me into the last thing I want to say here, that there is this common idea among mainstream Christian apologetics towards Latter-day Saints that if they just debunk Mormonism or debunk Joseph Smith, then that we'll go back to being normal Christians the way they want us to. And I just don't see it. Because Mormonism being false and Nicene Christianity being true are not tied to each other necessarily. My religion could be the fakest, scammiest, scummiest, most made-upest thing ever, and Joseph Smith's point would still stand, I think. And if I were to find myself suddenly in need of a new religion, I don't think I'd go to mainstream Christianity, because I want a religion that doesn't have this fundamental disconnection with its own God. Anyway, that's it for this week. I think I'm about to get Zerg-rushed by a bunch of 14-year-olds who want to yell at me about the Trinity, so if you're 14 and you want to yell at me about the Trinity, please check out this video right over here. Otherwise, this has been Saint Explainer. Stick around for more explained things about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. See you next week.